Growing up in my family was like living in two different worlds. My younger brother, Eric, was treated like royalty, while I, the older sibling, was left to fend for myself. The favoritism wasn't subtle, it was glaringly obvious to anyone who spent time with us. Eric, now 28, has been the center of my parents' universe since the day he was born. I'm 35, and the difference in how we were treated has been stark for as long as I can remember. When Eric was a baby, my parents acted as though he was a fragile treasure that needed constant protection. They catered to his every whim, even when it came at my expense. I still vividly recall my 10th birthday party being cancelled because Eric had a cold. Not a fever, just a mild sniffle. "We can't celebrate without Eric," my mother had said, shaking her head like it was the most logical thing in the world. "He'll feel left out." My 10-year-old self was devastated. It was the first time I truly understood that Eric's feelings would always come before mine. Over the years, the pattern continued. My accomplishments were brushed aside as though they were insignificant, while Eric was praised for the smallest achievements. I was the debate team captain in high school, a straight-A student, and even received a partial scholarship for my SAT scores. But my parents barely noticed. Instead, they were too busy congratulating Eric for passing his classes with CS. "He's really trying," they would say, as if mediocrity was something to celebrate. Parent-teacher conferences were a joke. The teachers would rave about my performance, but my parents only wanted to know how they could help Eric improve. By the time I turned 18, I'd had enough. I moved out, determined to build a life on my own terms. I worked multiple jobs to pay for my computer science degree and eventually landed a great position at a software company. Life was finally looking up. I met Darla, my wife, at work. She's everything my family isn't: supportive, kind, and genuinely proud of my accomplishments. We've been married for 5 years now and have 2 beautiful children, James, who's 3, and Emma, our 6-month-old baby. Eric, on the other hand, never left home. After dropping out of community college during his first semester because it was too stressful, he returned to my parents' house. He's 28 now and works part-time at a video game store, but most of his time is spent gaming. My parents enable him completely. They pay for his meals, car insurance, gaming subscriptions, and even his expensive gaming equipment. When I once suggested that Eric might want to find a full-time job, my mother acted as though I'd proposed throwing him into the wilderness. "He's sensitive," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand how hard it is for him." Hard? Eric had everything handed to him on a silver platter. Meanwhile, I worked multiple jobs to pay for college and saved for years to buy my first home. But somehow, in their eyes, I was the one who didn't understand hardship. Last year, we threw James's first birthday party. My parents insisted on hosting it at their house, even though I would have preferred to celebrate at home. "Eric would love to be a part of the day," Mom said. "It'll mean a lot to him." Against my better judgment, I agreed. At first, everything went smoothly. The garden was decorated with balloons and streamers, and James was having a wonderful time with his family. I was starting to think maybe I'd made the right decision. But then lunchtime rolled around. I was filling my plate with food, pasta with marinara sauce, to be exact, when I accidentally bumped into Eric. Some of the sauce spilled onto his shirt, a new limited edition gaming tee he'd been raving about all morning. I immediately apologized. "I'm so sorry, Eric. I'll pay for dry cleaning or buy you a new one." But Eric wasn't interested in apologies. His face turned red, and he began yelling loud enough for the entire room to hear. "You ruin everything," he shouted, glaring at me like I'd committed some unforgivable crime. He started listing every perceived slight I'd ever committed against him, going all the way back to childhood. He brought up the time I tripped over his game console cord when I was 12, causing it to break. He even mentioned his 10th birthday party, where I took the last slice of pizza after skipping lunch to help set up. As the room fell silent, Eric slapped me across the face. The force of the slap made my cheek burn, but the real pain came from what happened next. My mother rushed over, not to check on me, but to fuss over Eric. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked, taking his hand. "Does your hand hurt?" My father stood silently, arms crossed, glaring at me as if I was the one who had done something wrong. James started crying from the commotion. Darla, holding him tightly, looked at me in shock. The room was filled with awkward murmurs as some guests looked away, clearly uncomfortable. I finally found my voice. "You're okay with this? Your son hit me at my own child's birthday party, and you're defending him? You're older," my mother said, shaking her head. "You should know better. Look what you did to his shirt. He saved up for weeks to buy that. That was it." Years of frustration and resentment boiled over. "You've enabled Eric his entire life," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You've let him act like this without ever holding him accountable. And now he's a 28-year-old man who still lives at home, plays video games all day, and lashes out at anyone who tells him the truth. You've let him walk all over you, and me, for years." My father cut me off. "If you can't respect your brother, then leave." So I did. I told Darla we were leaving, grabbed James, and walked out the door. After leaving my parents' house, I felt a mix of anger and relief. I was furious at how they had defended Eric yet again, but I also felt like I had finally stood up for myself. Darla supported me completely. She agreed that we needed to cut ties, not just for my sake, but for James's too. We didn't want our children growing up in an environment where abuse was normalized or excused because it's family. The calls and texts began later that same day. My parents demanded that I apologize to Eric. They said he was distraught and had locked himself in his room, refusing to come out because of the trauma of what happened. Trauma? All I had done was accidentally spill a little marinara sauce. Family members started calling, too, taking sides. Some scolded me for provoking Eric, saying I should have been more careful. Others dismissed the slap as just a little thing and accused me of overreacting. I blocked them all. A few relatives who had witnessed the incident expressed their support privately. They admitted they had seen the unfair treatment over the years but had stayed silent to avoid rocking the boat. Their words meant little to me. It felt like too little, too late. For the first time in my life, I cut my parents and Eric out completely. No calls, no texts, no visits. The silence was liberating. 2 years passed, and in that time, life changed in wonderful ways. James was thriving as a happy, energetic 3-year-old. Darla and I welcomed our second child, Emma, a sweet, curious baby who quickly became the center of our world. I received a promotion at work, which allowed us to purchase a larger home in a nice neighborhood. For the first time, I felt like I was truly in control of my life. My parents and Eric were nothing more than a distant memory. Darla and I agreed that we didn't need their drama, and we were content with our small but happy family. Then, one day, I got a call from an unknown number. At first, I considered ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. I answered, and on the other end of the line was my mother, crying so hard I could barely understand her. "Eric sold the house," she said between sobs. For a moment, I was too stunned to respond. "What do you mean he sold the house?" I asked. Through her tears, she explained that Eric had somehow transferred the house into his name and sold it without their knowledge. My parents had 2 weeks to vacate, and they had nowhere to go. But the real shock came next. She admitted the house had always been mine. 15 years ago, when my grandfather passed away, he left the house to me in his will. I was only 20 at the time and had just started college. My parents, however, decided not to tell me about the inheritance. Instead, they lived in the house rent-free and allowed Eric to do the same. They had planned to give him the house when he got his life together, reasoning that I was independent and didn't need it. For 15 years, they let me struggle. I worked multiple jobs to pay for college, saved for years to buy my first home, and lived with the constant weight of student loans. All while they lived comfortably in a house that legally belonged to me. I was furious. How did Eric even manage to transfer the house into his name? I demanded. He must have forged your signature, my mother admitted. He handled the paperwork while we were on vacation. We had no idea. She went on to say that Eric had been acting strangely for months. He'd started talking about moving out of state to live with friends he met online. They needed money for gaming equipment, and Eric began asking questions about the ownership of the house. My parents, still blinded by their loyalty to Eric, trusted him when he said he needed the deed for business purposes. They never thought to question him. Now, the same son they had defended time and time again had betrayed them. I told my mother I needed time to think and hung up. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus on anything else. Anger boiled in my chest, not just at Eric for his audacity, but at my parents for their lies. They had stolen from me, enabling Eric to leech off them for years while I built my life through hard work. I relayed the conversation to Darla that evening. She was just as outraged as I was, but she reminded me to stay level-headed. You need to protect what's yours, she said. Talk to a lawyer first. The next day, I contacted an attorney. After reviewing the case, the lawyer confirmed that the house legally belonged to me under my grandfather's will. Since I had never signed any transfer documents, Eric's claim would not hold up in court. She added that forging my signature was a serious offense and recommended filing a lawsuit for forgery. The idea of suing my own brother felt strange, but I knew I couldn't let him get away with it. My parents had already allowed him to take advantage of them, and me, for far too long. In the days that followed, I received more calls from family members. My parents had told everyone what had happened, painting themselves as victims of Eric's betrayal. Many begged me to help them. They're old, one relative said. They have nowhere else to go. Some tried to guilt-trip me. What kind of son would let his parents become homeless? Others turned the situation on me, saying, if you just stayed in contact, none of this would have happened. But I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy for them. For 15 years, they had let Eric live rent-free in a house that was rightfully mine. They watched as I struggled to save for my own home and said nothing. They defended Eric when he hit me in front of my family, and they only came clean about the inheritance when they had no other choice. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same parents who had evicted me from their home 2 years ago were now begging for my help. The moment I decided to take legal action, a sense of clarity washed over me. I wasn't doing this to be vindictive or out of spite, I was doing it because it was the only way to protect what was rightfully mine. With my lawyer's help, we filed a lawsuit against Eric for forgery and fraudulent transfer of property. She assured me the case was solid, as the will explicitly named me as the rightful owner of the house. All the so-called transfer documents bore a forged version of my signature, which would be easy to prove. Over the next few months, I learned more about how Eric had pulled this off. Eric had discovered my grandfather's will while digging through old papers in my parents' home. The moment he realized the house was legally mine, he began plotting. He joined online communities dedicated to real estate fraud and even paid an internet consultant to help him create convincing fake documents. Where did he get the money for this scheme? From my parents, of course. They thought they were giving him funds for gaming equipment and conventions, not realizing he was using it to fund his fraudulent activities. When my parents went on vacation, Eric seized the opportunity. He filed the fake paperwork, claiming he had my power of attorney and forging my signature to finalize the transfer. By the time my parents returned, the house was legally in his name. He didn't waste any time. Within weeks, he put the house on the market and sold it. During the court proceedings, Eric's arrogance was on full display. He insisted he had done nothing wrong, claiming he deserved the house more than I did. They lived there for years, he argued. It was practically mine already. But the evidence was undeniable. The fake documents, the forged signatures, and even records of his online consultations left no room for doubt. After nearly 3 months of legal battles, the court ruled in my favor. The house was returned to my name, and Eric was evicted. The eviction itself was a spectacle. When the authorities arrived, Eric locked himself in his room, refusing to come out. He screamed through the door, accusing everyone, me, my parents, the legal system, of trying to destroy his life. It wasn't until they threatened to break the door down that he finally emerged, ranting and raving about how unfair it all was. For the first time in his life, Eric was forced to face real consequences. Not long after the eviction, my parents showed up at my doorstep. I hadn't spoken to them in over 2 years, but somehow, they had found my address. They arrived in complete disarray. My mother, sobbing uncontrollably, dropped to her knees in my driveway. My father, who had always been stoic, had tears streaming down his face as he apologized over and over again. "We have nowhere else to go," my mother cried. "Please, we're begging you. Let us stay." I stood there, torn. These were the same parents who had defended Eric when he slapped me, who had hidden my inheritance for 15 years, and who had never once apologized until now, when they had something to lose. Darla came outside to join me. She saw the hesitation on my face and whispered, "Let's talk about this first." We invited them inside and listened as they explained their situation. My parents admitted that they had spent all their savings on Eric. They paid for his failed college attempt, bought him countless gaming setups, covered his car payments and insurance, and even funded trips to gaming conventions. Every penny they had saved for retirement was gone. "We thought he'd eventually make it big," my dad said, his voice heavy with regret. "We believed if we supported him long enough, he'd succeed and take care of us. But we were wrong." My mother broke down as she confessed how they had enabled Eric's behavior. She said they'd noticed his manipulative tendencies years ago but had always made excuses for him. They believed he was sensitive and needed extra support, while I was independent and capable of handling myself. She even admitted to feeling guilty for the way they treated me. "We knew it wasn't fair," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But we didn't know how to stop." Hearing these confessions stirred something in me. For years, I had wanted them to acknowledge their favoritism and how it had hurt me. But now that they were finally saying the words, it felt hollow. They weren't apologizing because they'd had a change of heart, they were apologizing because they needed something from me. After discussing it with Darla, we decided to let my parents stay in the house under strict conditions. 1. They would pay rent, though we set it at a reduced rate because they were now on a fixed income. 2. They had to attend family therapy if they wanted any kind of relationship with me or their grandchildren. 3. Eric was never allowed to set foot in the house without my explicit permission. They agreed to the terms without hesitation. For the first time in their lives, my parents were forced to confront the consequences of their actions. Therapy became a requirement, not an option, and they began to unpack years of enabling behavior. Eric, predictably, did not take the eviction well. He began sending threatening messages to me, Darla, and even my parents. He accused me of turning them against him and ruining his life. He insisted the house was his and demanded to be let back in. I blocked his number and saved the messages as evidence in case I needed them later. The last I heard, Eric was couch-surfing at friends' houses. His plans to move out of state fell through when his gaming buddies realized he was broke and unreliable. Some family members urged me to help him, saying he was still my brother, but I refused. In my eyes, Eric had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Months passed, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. My parents settled into their new roles as tenants in what had once been their home, and I focused on maintaining the boundaries Darla and I had set. Therapy sessions with my parents were revealing. Each week, new layers of their favoritism were uncovered, along with the excuses they had made to justify their actions. In one particularly emotional session, my father admitted that they had always felt guilty about not giving Eric the same privileges I had as a young child. "When you were little, we were financially stable," he said. "But when Eric was born, things were tight. We couldn't give him the same things we gave you, and we felt like we had to make up for it." This guilt had driven them to overcompensate, spoiling Eric to the point where he believed the world revolved around him. What started as buying him extra toys and snacks became a lifelong habit of excusing his bad behavior. "It wasn't fair to you," my mother said, her voice trembling. "We thought you were strong enough to handle it, and we were wrong." Their words were long overdue, but they still didn't erase the years of pain I had endured. Out of the blue, I received an email from Eric. It was long, rambling, and filled with a mix of apologies and self-pity. He claimed he had started therapy and was beginning to see how his behavior had hurt me and our parents. He admitted that forging the documents and trying to steal the house was wrong, as was hitting me at James's birthday party. "I was angry and jealous," he wrote. "Mom and Dad always said you were the responsible one, and I felt like I could never live up to that. I thought the house was my way of finally proving I deserved something too." He ended the email with a request. He wanted to move back in with our parents, promising to pay rent this time. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the email to my attorney, who advised me to keep my distance. While Eric's words seemed sincere, his history of manipulation made me wary. When I told my parents about Eric's request, they didn't try to pressure me into letting him move back. In fact, they agreed that he wasn't ready to return. Therapy had helped them see that enabling Eric had done more harm than good, and they were determined not to fall back into old habits. My parents continued to pay rent and attend therapy, making slow but steady progress. They started spending more time with James and Emma, gradually rebuilding their relationship with my family. But there were moments when their old tendencies resurfaced. One evening, my mother casually mentioned that Eric was struggling to make his car payments and might lose his vehicle. She suggested we help him out, just this once. I shut it down immediately. "He's an adult," I said firmly. "If you want to help him, that's your choice, but not while you're living in my house." To her credit, she didn't argue. She nodded, quietly acknowledging that I was right. Over time, the dynamics in our family began to shift. Therapy gave my parents the tools to recognize their mistakes and start taking accountability. They stopped making excuses for Eric and focused on building a healthier relationship with me and my children. I wouldn't say things are perfect, there's still a lot of lingering hurt, but there's progress. As for Eric, the last I heard, he was working at a warehouse and sharing an apartment with 3 roommates. His dream of becoming a professional gamer had fizzled out, and he was finally starting to experience what it meant to live independently. I have no intention of letting him back into my life, but I hope he continues to make progress on his own. This entire experience taught me some hard but valuable lessons about family, boundaries, and self-respect. Being family doesn't mean tolerating abuse or manipulation. It doesn't mean sacrificing your own well-being for the sake of keeping the peace. Family is about mutual respect, accountability, and support. And when those things are missing, it's okay to set boundaries, even if others don't understand. My parents are lucky I allowed them to stay in the house after everything they did. They're even luckier that Darla and I are open to rebuilding our relationship with them, albeit on our terms. As for Eric, his actions have made it clear that he is no longer a part of my life. Forgiveness is one thing, but trust is another. And trust, once broken, isn't easily repaired. Now, I focus on the things that truly matter: my wife, my children, and the life we've built together. James and Emma are growing up in a home filled with love, respect, and fairness, things I never had as a child. Darla and I are committed to breaking the cycle and giving them the childhood I always wanted. I've learned that it's possible to forgive without forgetting, to set boundaries without guilt, and to demand respect without apology. Thank you for reading my story. If you're facing similar struggles with family, I hope my experience inspires you to prioritize your well-being and stand up for what's right. Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe and turn on notifications to be the first to have Radish and real stories with you. Have a great day.